The stone corridors of Ravencrest Castle had been Sir Marcus Thorne's sanctuary for 15 years. As captain of the Royal Guard, he knew every secret passage, every hidden alcove, every stone that had been laid by his ancestors who built this fortress centuries ago. But tonight, as he investigated strange sounds echoing from the castle's foundation, Marcus discovered something that made his blood turn to ice. The ancient chest was buried directly beneath the throne room, sealed with symbols that made his skin crawl just looking at them. Inside, wrapped in rotting silk, lay a collection of items that told a story Marcus never wanted to know. A blood-stained crown, his family's signet ring, and dozens of portraits showing faces identical to his own. Faces of men who had supposedly died natural deaths throughout the castle's history. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the first Marcus Thorne to serve as captain of the guard. He was part of something far more sinister, a cycle that had repeated for generations, and now it was his turn to pay the price. But what did the final item in the chest reveal about his fate, and why was his own death certificate dated for tomorrow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's torch trembled in his grip as he lifted the death certificate with his free hand. The parchment was pristine, as if it had been written moments ago, yet it bore the official seal of the royal physician, a man who had died 3 decades before Marcus was even born. His name was inscribed in elegant script, Sir Marcus Thorne, Captain of the Royal Guard. Cause of death, ritual sacrifice. Date, October 31st, 1847. Tomorrow's date. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. The strange sounds that had led him here, the rhythmic scraping like stone grinding against stone, had stopped the moment he'd broken the chest's seal. Now silence pressed against his ears with an almost physical weight. Marcus set the certificate aside with shaking fingers and examined the portraits more closely. Each painting showed a man in the distinctive armor of the Royal Guard captain, and each face was unmistakably his own. Same steel-grey eyes, same strong jaw, same small scar above the left eyebrow, a scar Marcus had received in childhood when he'd fallen from an apple tree. But that was impossible. These portraits were clearly old, some bearing dates stretching back over 2 centuries. The earliest was labelled Sir Marcus Thorne, 1623 to 1648, 25 years of service, ending at age 43. The same age Marcus was now. His breathing became shallow as he counted the portraits. 13 in total, each spanning exactly 25 years of service, each ending at age 43 on October 31st. Generation after generation of Marcus Thornes, all dying on the same date, all replaced by sons who looked exactly like their fathers. Sons who somehow retained no memory of their predecessors. A leather-bound journal lay beneath the portraits, its cover embossed with the royal seal. Marcus opened it with dread, and his father's handwriting stared back at him, though his father had died when Marcus was 5, supposedly of fever. To my son, who is myself, who is my father before me. If you are reading this, then the time has come for you to understand. We are not men, Marcus. We are vessels. The crown requires a guardian, one whose loyalty can never waver, whose dedication never falters. So the court magicians crafted us, eternal servants bound by blood and sorcery. Every 25 years, the vessel weakens. The magic requires renewal. On your 43rd birthday, you will feel the pull. You will descend to this chamber as I did, as my father did. You will place the crown upon your head and speak the words written on the final page. Then you will die, and your son will be born anew upstairs in the castle, already grown, already trained, already loyal. He will remember a childhood that never was, parents who never existed, a life carefully crafted to ensure perfect service. You have no choice in this, my son. You never did. The bloodline must continue. The crown must be protected. The cycle must not break. Your loving father, Sir Marcus Thorne, Captain of the Royal Guard. Written in the final hour of my service, 1822. Marcus slammed the journal shut, but the words had already burned themselves into his mind. He thought of his childhood memories, riding horses in meadows he could never quite locate on a map, training with mentors whose faces grew fuzzy when he tried to recall them clearly. Had any of it been real? Above him, he could hear the faint sounds of the castle stirring to life. Dawn was approaching, and with it, his final day of service. The crown in the chest seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, waiting for him to claim his destiny. But Marcus Thorne, whatever he truly was, had spent 15 years protecting the innocent, and he wasn't about to let that dedication die without a fight. The iron key felt impossibly cold against Gareth's palm as he descended the stone steps leading to the castle's deepest vaults. Each footfall echoed in the narrow corridor, a rhythmic countdown to whatever revelation awaited him in the darkness below. The torch in his free hand cast dancing shadows on the damp walls, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching him return. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the chest, 3 sleepless nights where his dreams were haunted by whispered voices speaking in tongues he didn't recognize. He'd tried to dismiss the discovery, to file his report and forget what lay buried beneath the castle's foundation. But the key, this damned key, had appeared on his pillow that first morning, as if the chest itself was calling him back. The chamber looked different in the torchlight. Smaller somehow, yet the shadows seemed to stretch infinitely into corners that shouldn't exist. The hole he'd fallen through gaped like a wound in the floor above, but his attention was drawn inexorably to the chest. It sat exactly where he'd left it, but now it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the strange symbols carved into its surface writhing in the flickering light. Gareth knelt beside it, his hand trembling as he inserted the key. The lock turned with surprising ease, accompanied by a sound like distant thunder. The lid opened on silent hinges, revealing contents that made his blood freeze in his veins. Books, ancient tomes bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic, their pages yellow with age and covered in the same writhing symbols that adorned the chest. But it was what lay between the books that truly horrified him. Portraits painted on canvas that should have crumbled to dust centuries ago, yet remained pristine in their awful clarity. The faces staring back at him were his own. Not similar, not bearing a family resemblance. They were identical in every detail, from the scar above his left eyebrow to the distinctive amber color of his eyes. Yet the clothing, the backgrounds, the painting styles, they spanned centuries. One portrait showed him in the armor of the ancient kingdom's first knights. Another depicted him in the ceremonial garb of a royal advisor from 300 years past. A third captured him in the simple robes of a castle scribe from an era when the kingdom was little more than a collection of feudal holdings. His hands shook as he lifted each portrait, counting them, 12 in total, spanning nearly a millennium of the kingdom's history. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the final portrait, lay a leather-bound journal. The moment his fingers touched its cover, words began to appear on the open page, as if written by an invisible hand. The circle completes itself once more. "Welcome home, brother." Gareth jerked his hand back, but the words remained, glowing faintly in the torchlight. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, he picked up the journal and began to read. The entries were written in his own handwriting, but chronicled events he had never experienced. Battles fought centuries before his birth, described in intimate detail as if he had wielded the sword himself. Political intrigues from the early days of the kingdom, recorded with the precision of someone who had orchestrated them. Love affairs with women whose names appeared in the castle's oldest genealogical records, their descendants now noble families he served with unwavering loyalty. But it was the final entries that made his world collapse entirely. "The binding grows weak again. I can feel it in my bones, this borrowed flesh beginning to fail. The curse that grants us eternal service demands its price. We must die so that we may live again. The bloodline continues through our sacrifice, each death ensuring our rebirth in the next generation. We are the guardians eternal, the watchers who never rest, the shield that never breaks. The chest calls to each new incarnation when the time comes to remember, to understand why we can never truly die, why we are forever bound to protect this kingdom and its royal line. The dark bargain struck by our ancestor ensures that we serve beyond death itself. When next these words are read, it will be by fresh eyes in a familiar face. Remember, brother of blood and shadow, the curse is also our blessing. We are the kingdom's eternal sentinel, reborn whenever duty demands. But beware the weakness that comes with each life. Do not let mortal attachments cloud our purpose, for if we fail in our charge, the consequences will echo through eternity. The journal slipped from Gareth's numb fingers. Everything he knew about himself, his family, his very identity, crumbled like sand. The fierce loyalty he'd always felt toward the crown, the inexplicable knowledge he sometimes displayed about the castle's hidden passages and forgotten protocols, the strange dreams that had plagued him since childhood, all of it made horrifying sense. He was not Gareth Blackthorne, loyal son of a minor noble family. He was something far older and more terrible, a fragment of consciousness bound by ancient magic to serve until the end of time itself. Above him, the castle bells began to toll midnight, their bronze voices carrying across the stones of his eternal prison. The torchlight flickered against the wooden chest as Gareth descended deeper into the hidden chamber, his boots echoing on ancient stone steps that shouldn't have existed. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying a metallic taste that reminded him of blood left too long in the sun. Behind him, the narrow passage he'd squeezed through seemed to exhale cold breath against his neck. The chest sat centered on a circular dais carved from black stone, surrounded by symbols that hurt to look at directly. Gareth had served the crown for 15 years, had studied the old texts and heraldic designs, but these markings belonged to no kingdom he recognized. They seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, suggesting shapes and meanings that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. His hand trembled as he reached for the iron clasp. The metal was warm despite the chamber's chill, and for a moment he hesitated. Every instinct screamed warnings, yet something deeper compelled him forward, a recognition that felt like coming home to a house he'd never seen before. The clasp opened with a soft click that echoed like breaking bone. Inside, nestled in rotted silk, lay a crown, unlike any in the royal treasury above. Its surface was neither gold nor silver, but something that seemed to absorb light while reflecting it in impossible ways. 7 gems adorned its circlet, each one containing what looked like moving shadow, but it was the object beside the crown that made Gareth's breath catch in his throat. A mirror, its surface perfectly black, lay wrapped in chains that had corroded into the glass itself. As he stared, his own reflection began to appear, but wrong, subtly altered. The face looking back had his features but different eyes, older and filled with a hunger he didn't recognize. "You've been away so long, my lord." Gareth spun toward the voice, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. The chamber remained empty, but the words seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very stones that had witnessed whatever ritual had consecrated this place. "Who's there? Show yourself." The mirror's surface rippled like water, and suddenly Gareth could see not his reflection, but a scene playing out as if through a window. A man who could have been his brother stood in what looked like the great hall above, but changed. The banners were different, the architecture older. The man wore the cursed crown and held the black mirror, speaking words in a language that made Gareth's teeth ache. Around the crowned figure knelt dozens of people, nobles and commoners alike, their faces blank with an adoration that looked more like death than devotion. As the man in the vision spoke, their eyes began to bleed. "The first of your line understood power," the voice continued, and now Gareth could tell it came from the mirror itself. King Aldrich the Wise, they called him, though his wisdom came from places the church would rather forget. He knew that true dominion requires sacrifice, that a crown's weight can only be borne by one willing to embrace what lesser men call darkness. The vision shifted, showing the same man, Aldrich, his ancestor, standing over a battlefield where the dead rose at his command. Enemy soldiers fled screaming as corpses fought alongside the royal army. Victory was absolute, terrible and wrong. "This is madness," Gareth whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't tear his gaze from the mirror. The images felt more real than the stone chamber around him, more true than the memories of his peaceful service to King Edmund. "The bloodline carries memory, young guardian. You feel it stirring, don't you? The recognition, the hunger for something greater than standing watch over a soft king in an age of comfort." The voice grew warmer, almost paternal. "Your ancestor built an empire that stretched across 3 kingdoms. He commanded death itself. And you polish armor and walk castle walls, pretending that protection means anything when true power is buried beneath your feet." Gareth's sword arm began to shake. The weapon felt impossibly heavy, though he'd wielded it in countless battles without strain. His reflection in the cursed mirror began to smile, not with his own lips, but with the expression he'd never made. "The current king grows suspicious of old bloodlines," the voice murmured. "Did you know he's been reading the sealed histories, learning about the old pacts, the prices paid for his family's throne? How long before he decides that certain loyalties have become inconvenient?" As if summoned by the words, footsteps echoed from the passage above. Real footsteps, not phantom sounds. Someone was coming. Choose quickly, heir of Aldrich. Remain a dog guarding sheep, or remember what it means to be the wolf. The mirror's surface began to brighten, and the crown seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices. King Edmund's voice, speaking words that made Gareth's blood freeze. "Find Sir Gareth." The old records speak clearly. His family served the Shadow Crown. We cannot allow that poison to spread. The torch flickered against the stone walls as Gareth descended into the forgotten depths beneath Ravenshollow Castle. Each step echoed through the narrow passage he discovered behind a loose stone in the foundation wall, the sound swallowed by shadows that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. The air grew colder with every footfall, carrying an acrid scent that made his throat burn and his eyes water. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision to return. The parchment fragments he'd found in his grandfather's trunk haunted his thoughts, cryptic warnings about the hunger beneath and blood calling to blood. His grandfather's handwriting, shaky near the end, had spoken of a duty passed down through generations of blackthorn guards, a secret so terrible it had driven men to madness. The passage opened into a circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to writhe in the torchlight, shifting between familiar letters and alien geometries that made his vision blur. At the chamber's center sat an iron chest, its surface black with age and decorated with the same twisted symbols that adorned the walls. Gareth's breath misted in the frigid air as he approached. The chest was larger than he'd expected, easily the size of a man's torso and heavier than iron should be. When he touched the lid, the metal burned cold against his palm, yet he couldn't pull his hand away. The symbols beneath his fingers pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The lock had corroded away centuries ago. The hinges screamed in protest as he lifted the lid, the sound echoing through the chamber like a death cry. Inside, wrapped in rotting silk, lay objects that defied explanation. The first was a crown, unlike any he'd seen in the royal treasury. Black metal twisted into thorny spirals, set with gems that gleamed with their own inner light, not the warm glow of precious stones, but something cold and hungry that seemed to drink in the torchlight. Beside it lay a ceremonial dagger, its blade inscribed with more of the writhing symbols, its edge still sharp enough to split shadow. But it was the book that made his blood freeze. Bound in leather that looked disturbingly like human skin, the tome was thick with pages that rustled like dried leaves when he opened it. The text within was written in multiple hands across what must have been centuries, each entry dated in the old calendar. The earliest entries were in archaic script he could barely decipher, but as his eyes adjusted to the faded ink, words began to emerge from the gloom. Year of the Bleeding Star, 847, the hunger grows stronger. 3 villagers found drained in the lower fields. Father says the compact must hold, but I fear we ask too much of the people. The thing beneath stirs when the moon wanes. Year of Iron Tears, 851. The Crown Prince shows the signs. His eyes reflect no light, and the dogs flee his presence. Mother weeps, but what choice have we? The bloodline must continue, or all will fall to shadow. Gareth's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed a horrifying cycle, members of the royal family transforming into something inhuman, feeding on their subjects, being contained or destroyed by loyal guards who bore the Blackthorn name. His ancestors had been executioners, not protectors, wielding the cursed blade against kings and queens who had become monsters. Year of Broken Chains, 1203, young Prince Marcus grows pale and thin, refusing all food save what we dare not name. Sir Edmund Blackthorn stands ready with the blade, as his father did and his father before him. The curse skips some generations, but it always returns. Always. Prince Aldric. Now King Aldric, ruler of the realm for the past decade, the man Gareth had sworn to protect with his life. Thunder crashed outside, and somewhere in the castle above, Gareth heard a sound that chilled him to the bone, a low, inhuman growling that seemed to come from the direction of the royal chambers. He looked down at the ceremonial dagger in the chest, its blade gleaming with anticipation. The book fell from his nerveless fingers as understanding crashed over him like a tide of ice water. His family hadn't been guardians of the royal bloodline. They had been its wardens, its executioners when the ancient curse transformed kings into predators. And now, if his grandfather's final entry spoke true, that terrible duty had passed to him. Above him, the growling grew louder, more insistent, and Gareth knew with cold certainty that his king was hunting tonight. The parchment felt impossibly fragile between Roderick's trembling fingers, its edges crumbling at his touch like autumn leaves. The ancient ink had faded to a rusty brown that reminded him uncomfortably of dried blood, and the script was in Old Valethorn, a dialect he could barely read. But certain words leaped out at him with crystalline clarity: Blackthorn, Covenant, 13th Moon, and most chilling of all, Price of Kings. He squinted in the wavering candlelight, struggling to decipher the cramped lettering. What he could make out sent ice through his veins. References to a bargain struck in desperation, a kingdom saved through unholy alliance, and a debt that would come due when the bloodline grows strong again. The document bore 2 signatures, one in ink, one in what could only be blood. The first was barely legible, but the family name was unmistakable, his own. A sound echoed from the corridor above. Footsteps on stone. Roderick's head snapped up, heart hammering. The measured pace suggested a guard making rounds, but at this hour, he quickly rolled the parchment and slipped it inside his tunic, then extinguished the candle with a pinch of his fingers. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole. The footsteps paused directly overhead. Through the ancient stones, Roderick heard the faint scrape of boot leather as someone shifted their weight, waiting, listening. He held his breath, pressing himself against the cold wall beside the tapestry. Minutes crawled by before the footsteps resumed, fading toward the east wing. Only when silence returned did Roderick dare to breathe again. But the brief interruption had shattered his focus, replacing it with paranoid awareness. How long had he been down here? Dawn couldn't be far off, and the castle would soon stir to life. He needed to return to his quarters before his absence was noted. Yet he couldn't leave, not yet. The chest still gaped open before him, promising more secrets. His fingers found another object nestled beneath torn fabric, something small and hard that felt like carved bone. When he struck flint to relight the candle, the object revealed itself as a ring bearing the royal seal of Valethorn. But this wasn't the current seal worn by King Aldric. This was older, bearing symbols that made his skin crawl just to look upon them. The ring was too large for his finger, But when he held it up to the candlelight, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Etched along the inner band in script so small it was barely visible were names. A genealogy, and there, near the end of the list, was his grandfather's name, then his father's, then his own. The candle flame guttered as if touched by an unfelt wind. In that moment of near darkness, Roderick could have sworn he heard something breathing in the chamber with him. Not the quick, frightened breaths of a living person, but something slow and patient and terrible. When the flame steadied, dancing shadows seemed to writhe with independent life across the stone walls. He pocketed the ring with shaking hands and forced himself to examine the chest's remaining contents. More documents. These in languages he didn't recognize, covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. A small vial containing what might once have been liquid, but had long since crystallized into dark residue. And at the very bottom, wrapped in rotting silk, an iron key whose purpose he couldn't fathom, but somehow filled him with dread. The key was warm to the touch despite the chamber's chill, and when his fingers closed around it, images flashed unbidden through his mind. A younger version of the castle, built differently, with passages and chambers that no longer existed, robed figures moving through midnight corridors, and always, the sense of something vast and hungry waiting in the darkness below. He jerked his hand away, but the visions lingered like after-images burned into his sight. Whatever this key unlocked, it was connected to the documents, to the ring, to the covenant his family had apparently made generations ago. The pieces of a puzzle were assembling themselves in his mind, forming a picture he desperately didn't want to see clearly. The breathing sound came again, closer now. Roderick's candle flame bent impossibly in the absence of any wind, reaching toward the corner where the shadows seemed deepest. For one heart-stopping moment, he thought he saw eyes gleaming in that darkness, not reflecting the candlelight, but glowing with their own cold radiance. Terror finally overcame curiosity. He snatched up the remaining documents and the key, leaving only the fabric scraps in the chest. The lid fell shut with a hollow boom that seemed to echo far too long in the stone chamber. Without looking back at whatever might be watching from the shadows, Roderick squeezed through the gap behind the tapestry and fled toward the surface, the weight of terrible knowledge heavy in his pockets and heavier still in his heart. The ancient parchment crumbled at its edges as Gareth spread it across his chamber floor, the candlelight casting dancing shadows over the faded ink. His hands trembled as he traced the genealogical lines that spiraled across the yellowed surface like the roots of some diseased tree. The Blackwood family crest dominated the top, a raven perched atop a crown, its eyes seeming to watch him accusingly. His finger followed the bloodline downward through generations of kings and queens, nobles and bastards, until it reached a name that made his breath catch in his throat. Elara Blackwood, born in the year of the Great Famine, died under mysterious circumstances. Beside her name, in different ink, someone had scratched a single word in the old tongue, Morian, the same word that had been carved into the chest. Gareth's mind reeled as he continued reading. According to the family tree, Elara had borne a child before her death, a daughter given to a family of castle guards for safekeeping. The surname listed beside the infant made his blood run cold. Thorn, his family name, his bloodline. A soft knock at his door made him start violently. He quickly rolled up the parchment and shoved it beneath his mattress as footsteps approached. "Sir Gareth?" The voice belonged to Willem, his young squire. "Captain Aldrich requests your presence in the Great Hall." "Urgent business," he says. "I'll be along shortly," Gareth called back, his voice hoarse. He waited until Willem's footsteps faded before retrieving the parchment and the obsidian pendant. The stone felt warm against his palm, pulsing with that same unnatural rhythm he'd first noticed in the chest. The great hall buzzed with tense conversation when Gareth arrived. Guards clustered in small groups, their faces grave, while servants hurried past with worried expressions. Captain Aldrich stood near the massive fireplace, his weathered face etched with concern. "Gareth, thank the gods," Aldrich said, striding over. "We have a situation. 3 more servants have fallen ill overnight. The same symptoms as young Mary. High fever, delirium, and—" He lowered his voice. "They speak of shadows moving through the walls. The castle physician is baffled." Gareth felt the pendant grow warmer in his pocket. "Have you informed King Edmund?" "The king has locked himself in his private chambers, claims he's conducting important research and mustn't be disturbed." Aldrich's eyes narrowed, but the servants who tend his rooms whisper of strange smells and sounds emanating from within. Incense and chanting at all hours. A chill ran down Gareth's spine. What kind of chanting? Old words, ancient tongue that none can translate. Aldrich placed a heavy hand on Gareth's shoulder. "I need you to investigate the lower levels again. Whatever's causing this sickness, I believe it originates from below. Take a squad with you this time." Gareth nodded, though dread pooled in his stomach like acid. He couldn't reveal what he'd found, not yet, not until he understood what it meant. But as he assembled his men and prepared torches for the descent, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leading them into something far worse than a simple investigation. The tunnels beneath the castle seemed different now, as if his discovery had awakened something that had long slumbered. The air hung thick and oppressive, carrying whispers that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. His men muttered nervously as they descended, their torches casting writhing shadows that appeared to move independently of the flames. They reached the chamber where he'd found the chest. The hole he'd dug remained, but now it seemed deeper, as if something had been clawing at the earth from below. Dark stains marked the surrounding stones, stains that hadn't been there before. Sir Gareth called Marcus, one of his most trusted men, from deeper in the tunnel. "You need to see this." Gareth followed Marcus's voice to a section of wall that had partially collapsed, revealing another chamber beyond. The space was older than anything else they'd encountered, its walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the room stood an altar carved from black stone, its surface stained with what looked like centuries of dried blood. But it was what lay behind the altar that made Gareth's knees buckle. Painted across the far wall in faded crimson was a massive family tree, not unlike the parchment he'd found, but far more detailed. Hundreds of names branched across the stone, connected by lines that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. At the tree's root, written in letters that seemed to bleed, was a single name: Morian Blackwood, first of the blood, mother of shadows. The pendant in his pocket had grown so hot it nearly burned through the fabric. As Gareth stared at the ancient mural, understanding crashed over him like a tide of ice water. The Blackwood bloodline carried more than noble heritage. It carried a curse that had been carefully hidden, passed down through generations of illegitimate children and forgotten branches. And now, somehow, that curse was awakening. The ancient parchments crackled like dry leaves as Gareth spread them across the stone floor of his quarters. Each document bore the royal seal, but the wax had turned black with age, and the ribbons had long since crumbled to dust. By candlelight, the archaic script seemed to writhe and dance, as if the very words sought to escape their bindings. The first scroll contained what appeared to be a birth registry, but the names listed made Gareth's blood run cold. Aldrich I, founder of the dynasty, was recorded not as born but as awakened. The date corresponded with local folklore about a terrible plague that had swept through the region centuries ago, killing thousands. According to the document, Aldrich had emerged from a mass grave, unchanged by death, to claim dominion over the surviving population. Gareth's hands trembled as he unrolled the next parchment. It detailed a covenant, a pact written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The terms were explicit. In exchange for immortality and the power to rule, the Aldrich bloodline would serve as vessels for something called the Eternal Hunger. Every third generation, a member of the royal family would undergo a transformation, becoming what the document referred to as a harvester of souls. The mathematical implications hit him like a physical blow. King Marcus was third generation from his grandfather, King Aldrich IV. If the pattern held true, if this madness was real, then Marcus was destined to become something monstrous. A soft knock at his door shattered the oppressive silence. Gareth quickly gathered the documents, shoving them beneath his mattress just as the door creaked open. "Sir Gareth?" Princess Lyanna's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw the light under your door. I couldn't sleep." She entered uninvited, her nightgown ghostly pale in the flickering candlelight. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her usually perfect composure had cracked, revealing something fragile and frightened beneath. "Your Highness, it's quite late. Perhaps you should—" "I've been having dreams," she interrupted, settling onto the wooden chair by his desk. "Terrible dreams about Father. In them, he's different, changed, and there's always so much blood." Gareth felt ice forming in his veins. "Dreams are often just reflections of our daily worries, Princess. Your father has been under considerable strain lately." Lyanna's laugh was hollow and bitter. "Have you noticed he no longer eats in our presence? Or that he's dismissed half the kitchen staff? The remaining servants whisper about sounds coming from the lower chambers at night. Sounds like screaming." Every word she spoke aligned perfectly with the documents hidden beneath his bed. Gareth struggled to maintain his composure, but years of training couldn't quite suppress the growing horror in his chest. "There's something else," Lyanna continued, her voice dropping to barely audible. "I found bloodstains on his clothes, fresh ones. And yesterday, Lord Pemberton's youngest son went missing from the castle. Father claims the boy simply returned home, but I saw his mother in the market. She's been searching for him desperately." The harvester of souls. The phrase echoed in Gareth's mind as he watched the princess struggle with her suspicions about her own father. According to the documents, the transformation was gradual but inevitable. The afflicted would first lose their appetite for normal food, then begin craving something far more sinister. The bloodlust would grow until it consumed them entirely. "Princess," Gareth said carefully, "if you truly believe something is wrong, perhaps we should—" Lyanna gripped Gareth's arm with surprising strength. "He does this every night now," she whispered urgently. "He goes to the lower levels and doesn't return until dawn. Follow him, Sir Gareth. Please. I need to know what's happening to my father." The footsteps faded down the corridor, heading toward the stone stairs that led to the castle's foundation levels, the same area where Gareth had discovered the cursed chest. The coincidence was too terrible to ignore. "Stay here," Gareth commanded, grabbing his sword belt. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except—" "Except Father?" Lyanna's voice cracked with bitter irony. "How do I know he's still the man who raised me? How do I know he won't hurt me too?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Gareth had no answer, because he feared she was right. The document suggested that once fully transformed, the harvester lost all human connections, viewing even loved ones as nothing more than potential prey. As he prepared to follow the king into the castle's darkest depths, Gareth realized he was walking toward a confrontation that would either save his kingdom or destroy everything he'd spent his life protecting. The truth, when it finally emerged, would change them all forever. The ancient tome's pages crackled like autumn leaves as Gareth turned them with trembling fingers. Each word seemed to writhe on the parchment, as if the ink itself resisted being read. The candlelight flickered nervously, casting dancing shadows that made the illustrations appear to move, twisted figures performing unspeakable rituals, their faces bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his own angular features. "The Blackthorn Covenant," he whispered, reading the elaborate script at the top of one particularly disturbing page. His surname stared back at him like an accusation written in blood. The text detailed a pact made 3 centuries ago when the kingdom faced annihilation from a plague that turned men into ravenous beasts. Lord Marcus Blackthorn, Gareth's ancestor, had discovered a ritual that could bind the plague's source, but the price demanded was steep. Every 7th generation, a Blackthorn heir would transform into the very monster their family had sworn to contain. The curse would claim them on the anniversary of the original binding, and only another's willing sacrifice could delay the inevitable. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs as he counted backward through the genealogy meticulously recorded in the tome's margins. His great-great-grandfather, dead at 28 under mysterious circumstances. His grandfather, who had simply vanished one autumn night, leaving behind only blood-stained clothes and whispered rumors of wolf attacks. His father, who had died when Garrett was barely a boy, officially from fever, though now Garrett remembered the locked rooms, the strange howling that had echoed through their estate, and his mother's terrified eyes. The seventh generation. Garrett was the seventh generation. His reflection caught his attention in the polished surface of his sword propped against the wall. Even in the wavering candlelight, he could see the subtle changes beginning. His canine teeth seemed sharper, his eyes held flecks of amber that hadn't been there before, and when he flexed his hands, his fingernails appeared slightly elongated. A soft knock at his chamber door made him slam the tome shut. "Sir Garrett." It was young Thomas, one of the newest recruits to the Guard. "Captain requires your presence in the throne room immediately." "I'll be there shortly," Garrett called, his voice rougher than usual. He quickly concealed the chest and its contents beneath his bed, throwing a heavy blanket over the suspicious bulge. The throne room buzzed with tension when he arrived. Captain Morris stood before King Edmund, his weathered face grave. Several other guards flanked them, including Sir Helena, whose sharp eyes immediately fixed on Garrett with obvious concern. "Ah, Blackthorn," the king said, his voice heavy with worry. "We have disturbing news. 3 more bodies were discovered at dawn near the eastern wall, same as the others, torn apart, partially consumed. The people are beginning to panic." Garrett's stomach lurched. The attacks had been growing more frequent, more vicious. Now he understood why. "The creature seems to be growing bolder," Captain Morris continued. "Or perhaps more desperate. We've doubled the patrols, but—" Sir Helena stepped forward, her hand resting on her sword hilt. "You seem unusually knowledgeable about predatory behavior, Garrett. Have you encountered such creatures before?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Garrett could feel the transformation's pull growing stronger, a gnawing hunger that made his vision sharpen and his sense of smell intensify. He could detect the fierce sweat of everyone in the room, could hear their individual heartbeats like a grotesque symphony. "Only what I've read in the castle's historical texts," he managed, fighting to keep his voice steady. "There are precedents for such attacks in our kingdom's past." King Edmund leaned forward on his throne, his pale eyes studying Garrett intently. "Then perhaps you have insights into how we might capture this beast. The anniversary of St. Valdris approaches, and I will not have my people cowering in their homes while some monster stalks our streets." The anniversary. Garrett's blood turned to ice as he realized the significance. St. Valdris Day marked the same date as the original binding ritual, barely 3 days away. The timing was no coincidence. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I believe I may have found some relevant information in the castle archives. Grant me 2 days to research further, and I promise I'll have answers." The king nodded slowly. "Very well. But understand, Sir Blackthorn, if these attacks continue, I'll have no choice but to implement a city-wide curfew and begin house-to-house searches. We will find this creature, whatever the cost." As the assembly dispersed, Garrett caught his reflection in one of the tall windows. For just a moment, something inhuman stared back at him, something with golden eyes and far too many teeth. 2 days. He had 2 days to find another solution before the curse claimed him completely and turned him into the very monster terrorizing his beloved kingdom. The torch flickered against the stone walls as Gareth descended deeper into the castle's forgotten depths, the ancient chest's weight seeming to increase with each step. His mind reeled from what he'd discovered: the blood-stained documents, the ritual implements, and worst of all, the family crest that marked him as descendant of those who'd committed unspeakable acts in these very chambers. Behind him, the sound of boots on stone echoed through the narrow passages. Captain Aldrich had insisted on accompanying him, despite Gareth's protests that this burden was his alone to bear. The older man's weathered face remained grim as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels that honeycombed the castle's foundation. "There," Gareth whispered, pointing to a heavy iron door partially concealed behind centuries of accumulated debris. "The chamber from the drawings." Aldrich raised his own torch, illuminating rusted hinges and a lock that had long since corroded away. The door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for their arrival. A foul odor seeped through the gap, not the musty scent of age, but something organic and putrid that made both men's stomachs turn. "Are you certain about this?" Aldrich asked, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "Perhaps we should inform the king first. Gather more men." Gareth's voice was firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Whatever lies beyond that door, it's connected to my bloodline, my ancestors' sins. I won't drag others into this nightmare until I understand what we're truly facing." The iron door groaned as Gareth pushed it open, the sound echoing through the chamber beyond like a death knell. Their torchlight revealed a circular room carved from the living rock, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing flames. The air was thick with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. At the chamber's center stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained dark with what could only be dried blood. Channels carved into its edges led to collection basins, creating an intricate network designed for one horrifying purpose. But it was what lay beyond the altar that made both men freeze in terror. Bones, hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns across the floor, not the yellowed remains of ancient dead, but bones that gleamed white in the torchlight, as if they'd been cleaned recently. Among them, scraps of fabric suggested these had once been people, servants perhaps, or unfortunates who'd ventured too deep into the castle's depths. "Dear God," Aldrich breathed, making the sign of the cross. "How long has this been going on?" Gareth moved closer to the altar, his torch revealing fresh scratches in the stone surface. "These marks, they're recent. Someone's been using this place." His blood ran cold as the implication hit him. The disappearances, the servants who vanished over the years. Everyone assumed they'd simply left their positions, but a sound echoed from the shadows beyond their torchlight, a wet, dragging noise that spoke of something large moving in the darkness. Both men drew their swords, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbards. "Show yourself!" Aldrich commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Laughter answered him, low, throaty, and utterly without humor. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Gareth's heart nearly stopped. It was Sir Marcus, the king's most trusted adviser, but changed in ways that defied comprehension. His skin was pale as parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long for any human frame. His eyes had taken on a milky white sheen, and when he smiled, his teeth appeared to have been filed to points. "Young Gareth," Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in any human throat. "I wondered when you'd find your way here. The bloodline calls to its own, you know. Your ancestor Damien was quite enthusiastic in his devotion to our cause." "Our cause?" Gareth raised his sword, though his hands shook. "What are you talking about?" Marcus gestured to the symbols on the walls, which now seemed to glow with their own sickly light. "The preservation of the realm, of course. Do you think the kingdom's prosperity these past centuries came without cost? Your family understood that sacrifice is necessary. Blood must be spilled to maintain the barriers that keep darker things at bay." "You're mad," Aldrich snarled, stepping forward. "These are innocent people you've murdered." "Innocent?" Marcus tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "They died in service to their betters, as is proper, but their deaths serve a greater purpose. Each life offered strengthens the wards that protect this land from the horrors that lurk beyond the veil." The torches around the chamber suddenly flared to life of their own accord, revealing the full scope of the nightmare. The walls were covered not just in symbols, but in preserved human skin bearing those same markings. The ritual had been going on for generations, hidden beneath their feet while they'd served and protected the very evil they'd sworn to oppose. Gareth felt the weight of his bloodline's sins crushing down upon him, even as Marcus began to chant in a language that predated human civilization. The ancient tome lay open before Gareth like a wound in reality itself, its yellowed pages crackling with each turn. The leather binding felt warm beneath his trembling fingers, as if the book still retained some vestige of life from whatever creature had provided its skin. He had barricaded himself in the castle's abandoned scriptorium, far from prying eyes and the daily bustle of court life that now seemed impossibly distant. Each page revealed another horror, another piece of the puzzle that formed his family's true legacy. The Blackwood name, which he had carried with such pride, was written throughout the tome in contexts that made his stomach churn. Sacrificial rites, blood pacts, generational offerings to entities whose names hurt to read. The ink seemed to shift before his eyes, the archaic script rearranging itself into more comprehensible text, as if the book itself wanted to be understood. He read of his great-grandfather, Lord Edmund Blackwood, who had first made contact with something called the Crimson Court, beings from a realm where flesh was currency and suffering was sustenance. The initial bargain had been simple, protection for the kingdom in exchange for regular tribute. Gareth's hands shook as he discovered what that tribute had been. Every 7 years, a member of the royal bloodline, not killed outright, but taken to serve the Crimson Court in their twisted realm. The missing princes and princesses throughout history, the ones recorded as dying of plague or accident, they had all been offerings, handed over by his ancestors to maintain their dark pact. But the arrangement had evolved. The tome detailed how his grandfather, Lord Marcus Blackwood, had grown ambitious. Instead of merely facilitating the tributes, he had sought to gain more power from the entities. The rituals became more elaborate, the sacrifices more frequent. The Crimson Court had been pleased with Marcus's enthusiasm and had granted him extended life and supernatural strength. The price had been his bloodline's freedom. From that point forward, the Blackwood family would serve as eternal guardians of the pact, bound by blood magic to ensure its continuation. They would live longer than normal men, their reflexes would be inhuman, their loyalty to the crown absolute, but they would never be free to choose their own path. Gareth understood now why he had always felt that strange compulsion to serve, why the thought of abandoning his post caused him physical pain. He wasn't noble by choice, but by curse. His very blood sang with enchantments that made betrayal impossible. The worst revelation came near the tome's end. His father, the previous captain of the Royal Guard, had tried to break the pact. The book detailed his desperate attempts to find a way to free the family from their supernatural bondage. Lord Harrison Blackwood had discovered that the binding could be severed, but only through a specific ritual that required the willing sacrifice of someone carrying both royal and Blackwood blood. The implications struck Gareth like a physical blow. His father's friendship with the late king hadn't been mere camaraderie between warriors. There had been a deeper connection, one that had resulted in Gareth himself, a child carrying both bloodlines, born specifically to serve as the key to breaking the curse. But his father had never gone through with it. The book's final entries, written in his father's familiar hand, detailed his inability to sacrifice his son for freedom. Instead, Harrison had chosen to die with the secret, hoping perhaps that ignorance might protect Gareth from the full weight of his destiny. A sound in the corridor beyond the scriptorium made Gareth slam the tome shut. Footsteps approached, deliberate and measured. He quickly extinguished the candles and pressed himself against the wall, clutching the book to his chest. "Sir Gareth?" The voice belonged to Princess Elena. "I saw light beneath the door. Are you well?" His heart hammered against his ribs. Here she was, the very person whose blood could free him from generations of bondage, if he could bring himself to perform the ritual his father had abandoned. The irony was crushing. The woman he had sworn to protect was also the key to his salvation. "I'm here, Your Highness," he called softly, moving to unbar the door. "Couldn't sleep." Elena entered the dim room, her nightgown ghostly pale in the moonlight streaming through the narrow windows. She carried a candle that cast dancing shadows across her worried features. "You've been avoiding me since yesterday, ever since you came back from whatever errand took you away from the castle." Garrett met her eyes, seeing in them the same kindness that had made her father such a beloved king, the same trust that made his current knowledge feel like poison in his veins. She had no idea that the loyal guard she depended upon was contemplating her death as a means of escape. "There are things I need to tell you," he said finally, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "About your family, about mine, about why some secrets should remain buried." Elena stepped closer, her expression growing grave. "Then tell me, Garrett. Whatever darkness you've uncovered, we'll face it together." If only she knew how literal that statement might prove to be. The ancient tome felt heavier than lead in Gareth's trembling hands as he made his way through the castle's labyrinthine corridors. Dawn was still hours away, and the shadows seemed to reach for him with gnarled fingers, as if sensing the terrible knowledge he now carried. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. He had spent the remainder of the night in the archives, cross-referencing bloodlines and dates, praying that his suspicions were wrong. But the evidence was undeniable. The Blackthorn curse wasn't just legend, it was documented fact, recorded in meticulous detail by scribes who had witnessed its horrors firsthand. Every 3 generations, the tome revealed, a child would be born bearing the mark. A child who would grow to become something inhuman, something that fed on the life force of others. The royal family had managed to hide this truth for centuries, always finding ways to explain away the mysterious deaths, the withered corpses found in locked chambers, the servants who aged decades in mere weeks. Gareth's mind reeled as he recalled Princess Lyanna's recent behavior, her newfound vitality after months of weakness, the way the elderly cook had suddenly taken ill after serving her breakfast, how the young stable boy had collapsed after helping her mount her horse. The signs had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. He paused outside the princess's chambers, his hand hovering over the door handle. Inside, he could hear movement, soft footsteps, the rustle of fabric. His duty as a royal guard demanded he protect her, but what did duty mean when the very person he was sworn to serve had become a predator? The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Gareth quickly stepped back from the door, concealing the tome beneath his cloak. Captain Aldrich emerged from the shadows, his weathered face etched with concern. "Sir Gareth," Aldrich's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been looking for you. There's been another incident." Gareth's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "Young Marcus, the page who delivered the princess's evening meal. We found him this morning in the servants' quarters." Aldrich's expression was grim. "He looks like he aged 30 years overnight. The physicians are baffled." The tome seemed to burn against Gareth's chest where he had hidden it. He forced his voice to remain steady. "Is he alive?" "Barely. He keeps muttering about the princess's eyes, how they seem to glow in the candlelight." Aldrich studied Gareth's face carefully. "You don't seem surprised by this news." Before Gareth could respond, the door to the princess's chambers opened. Princess Lyanna emerged, radiant and beautiful, her skin practically luminous in the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. She wore a flowing white nightgown that made her appear almost ethereal. "Captain Aldrich, Sir Gareth," she said, her voice like honey. "What brings you to my chambers at such a late hour? Surely there's no danger within these walls." Gareth met her gaze and felt his breath catch. Her eyes, which had always been a soft brown, now held flecks of gold that seemed to swirl and dance. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. "Your Highness," Aldrich bowed slightly, "there was an incident with one of the servants. We wanted to ensure your safety." "How thoughtful," Lyanna smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression. "I do hope the poor dear recovers soon. I would hate for anything to happen to those who serve our family so faithfully." The words carried a weight that made Gareth's skin crawl. She knew. Somehow she was aware of what she was becoming, perhaps even embracing it. "We should let you rest, Your Highness," Gareth managed, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. "Morning will come soon enough." "Indeed it will," Lyanna replied, her golden-flecked gaze lingering on him for a moment too long, and with it new opportunities for growth. She retreated into her chambers, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. Aldrich waited until her footsteps faded before speaking again. "There's something you're not telling me, Gareth. I've seen that look before, the look of a man carrying terrible knowledge." Gareth's mind raced. Could he trust Aldrich? The captain had served the crown faithfully for decades, but how deep did his loyalty run? Would he choose duty to the realm over loyalty to the royal bloodline? "Meet me in the armory in 1 hour," Gareth whispered finally. "And Captain, bring silver, as much as you can carry." Aldrich's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded without question. As he disappeared into the shadows, Gareth remained standing outside the princess's door, listening to the soft sounds within. Soon, he would have to make an impossible choice between his oath and his conscience. The curse was awakening, and time was running out. The catacombs beneath the castle stretched endlessly in every direction, carved from living rock centuries before the first foundation stone was laid. Gareth's torch cast dancing shadows on the walls as he descended deeper, following the crude map he'd sketched from the journal's cryptic directions. Each step echoed like a funeral bell in the oppressive silence. The air grew thicker as he descended, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something that made his stomach turn. Sweet decay, like flowers left too long in a tomb. The torch flame flickered, and for a terrifying moment he thought it might die completely, leaving him in absolute darkness with whatever horrors waited below. He paused at a junction where 3 passages converged, consulting his makeshift map by torchlight. The journal had been specific about this place. Where the 3 paths meet, take the left passage to the Chamber of First Blood. His ancestors' spidery handwriting seemed to mock him from the yellowed pages. The left passage sloped downward at a steep angle, forcing him to brace against the walls for balance. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone here, predating any language he recognized. They seemed to writhe in the torchlight, and he found himself avoiding direct eye contact with them, as if they might somehow notice his presence. The passage opened into a circular chamber, and Gareth's breath caught in his throat. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be a mummified figure wrapped in rotting cloth. But these weren't ordinary burial shrouds. They were bound with iron chains, and strange symbols had been burned directly into the wrappings. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with centuries of accumulated filth. Behind it, carved into the far wall, was a massive relief depicting scenes that made his blood run cold. Figures in royal regalia stood over writhing masses of people, their hands raised as if conducting some terrible symphony. Above them all loomed a creature that defied description, part shadow, part flesh, with eyes that seemed to follow his movements even in stone. "You found it." The voice came from the darkness behind him, and Gareth spun around, his sword clearing its sheath in one fluid motion. Princess Lyanna stepped into the torchlight, but something was wrong with her appearance. Her skin was pale as parchment, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface like a spider's web. Her eyes, once a warm brown, now held an unsettling golden gleam. "Your Highness," he managed, keeping his blade steady despite the tremor in his voice. "What are you doing here?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I could ask you the same question, loyal Gareth, though I suppose you've read enough of our family history to know why I'm here." She gestured to the chamber around them. "Welcome to the heart of our legacy. The journal spoke of a curse, but this—" He glanced at the mummified figures. "What happened to them?" "Failed vessels," Lyanna said casually, moving closer to the altar. "Generations of our family who couldn't contain what we inherited. They had to be contained themselves." She ran her fingers along the stained stone surface. "But I'm different. I'm strong enough. Strong enough for what? Her smile revealed teeth that seemed too sharp. To complete the binding, to finally give our ancestor the form he's been denied for so long. She turned to face him fully, and he saw that the golden gleam in her eyes was growing brighter. Do you know what it feels like, Gareth? To have something ancient and powerful sharing your thoughts, your dreams. It's been growing stronger every day since I turned 18. Since the bloodline matured in me. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. The recent deaths in the castle, the servants found drained of blood. That was you. That was practice, she corrected. Small offerings to strengthen the connection. Tonight is when it all changes. Tonight, I open the final seal. She pointed to the altar, and he saw now that it wasn't just stained, it was carved with channels that led to a circular depression in the center. I can't let you do this, he said, raising his sword. Lyanna's laugh echoed off the chamber walls. You think you can stop destiny, dear Gareth? You think your sword can cut through centuries of careful planning? She began to speak in a language he didn't recognize, words that seemed to resonate in his bones. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly phosphorescence, and the wrapped figures in the alcoves started to shift and moan. The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and his breath came out in visible puffs. The blood of kings calls to blood, Lyanna chanted, drawing a curved dagger from her robes. The debt of power must be paid in full. Gareth stepped forward, but the air itself seemed to thicken around him, making movement difficult. Whatever ancient power dwelt in this place was awakening, and he could feel its attention turning toward him like a massive, malevolent eye. The princess raised the dagger high above the altar, and her voice rose to a shriek that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. The screaming had stopped 3 hours ago, but Marcus could still hear it echoing through the stone corridors of his mind. He pressed his back against the cold wall of the dungeon, watching Captain Aldrich pace like a caged wolf before the iron-barred cell that held what remained of Princess Lyanna. She's not responding to holy water, Aldrich muttered, his weathered face etched with lines of exhaustion and terror. The priests tried everything, even blessed silver burns her skin, but it doesn't change her back. Marcus forced himself to look through the bars. The thing that had been Lyanna sat motionless in the far corner, her once golden hair now white as bone, her skin bearing the same pale luminescence they'd seen on the creatures in the ancient chamber. Her eyes, when she occasionally lifted her head, held depths that seemed to swallow light itself. The transformation is accelerating, Marcus whispered, just like the journal described. The bloodline curse doesn't just mark its victims, it consumes them entirely. Aldrich's hand went instinctively to his sword hilt. Then we have to act now, before King Roderick. Before I what, Captain? Both men spun to find the king standing at the dungeon entrance, his royal robes replaced by simple traveling clothes, his crown absent. But it was his eyes that made Marcus's blood freeze. The same otherworldly depth beginning to manifest, the same pale gleam starting to emerge. Your Majesty, Aldrich stammered, stepping protectively in front of Marcus. You shouldn't be here. The princess is unwell. King Roderick's laugh carried no warmth. Unwell? Is that what we're calling it? He moved past them with fluid grace, approaching his daughter's cell. Hello, my dear. How are you feeling? Lyanna's head snapped up at his voice, and for a moment Marcus glimpsed something almost human in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even love, but it vanished as quickly as smoke. Hungry, she whispered, her voice like wind through a graveyard. So very hungry, father. The king nodded as if this were the most natural response in the world. I understand. The hunger is overwhelming, isn't it? It gnaws at your very soul. My lord, Marcus stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached into his cloak. I found this in the chest, beneath the other artifacts. I think it might help us understand what's happening. He produced a leather-bound book, smaller than the journal but far older. Its cover bore the same twisted symbols they'd seen carved into the chamber walls, but these seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. King Roderick's eyes fixed on the tome with hungry intensity. Where did you find this? Hidden in a secret compartment. It appears to be a record of the original curse, and possibly a way to break it. Give it to me. The command carried such authority that Marcus almost obeyed instantly. But something in the king's tone, a subtle wrongness that hadn't been there days ago, made him hesitate. Perhaps we should examine it together, Your Majesty. The text is in an ancient dialect and... I said, give it to me. King Roderick's voice dropped to a growl, and the pale gleam in his eyes flared brighter. Do not make me repeat myself again. Aldrich's sword whispered from its sheath. Your Majesty, with respect, I think Sir Marcus raises a valid point. We should proceed with caution. The king turned slowly to face his captain of guards, and Marcus saw something that would haunt him forever. Roderick's features were subtly shifting, his cheekbones becoming more pronounced, his skin taking on that terrible luminescence. Captain Aldrich, the king said softly, you have served my family faithfully for 20 years. Do not force me to question your loyalty now. From her cell, Princess Lyanna began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that made all three men flinch. He can feel it too, can't you, father? The hunger, the need. It whispers such beautiful promises. Promises? Marcus clutched the book tighter. What kind of promises? Lyanna pressed her face against the bars, her skin now translucent enough to reveal dark veins beneath. Power beyond imagining. Freedom from the weakness of mortality, the ability to reshape the world according to our will. Her gaze fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. The chest wasn't just a prison, loyal guardian. It was an incubator, and now that it's been opened, now that the bloodline has been awakened, there's no stopping what we're becoming. King Roderick smiled, and Marcus saw that his teeth had grown sharp. She's right, of course. The curse isn't our burden, it's our birthright. And soon, very soon, the entire kingdom will understand. Aldrich raised his sword, but his hands were shaking. I won't let you harm innocent people. Harm them? The king laughed. My dear captain, I'm going to liberate them. From fear, from weakness, from the pathetic limitations of human existence. Marcus gripped the book and ran. The ancestral blade trembled in Gareth's grip as he faced the writhing shadow that had once been Prince Aldrich. The curse had consumed the last traces of humanity in the young royal's features, leaving only hollow sockets that wept darkness and flesh that rippled like liquid midnight. You cannot destroy what flows in your own veins, the thing that was Aldrich hissed, its voice echoing from multiple throats. The bloodline calls to itself, guardsman. Can you not feel it singing in your bones? Gareth's sword arm burned where the ancient runes had carved themselves into his flesh during the ritual. The pain was excruciating, but it also granted him clarity. Through the agony, he could sense the truth. The curse wasn't just in the royal line, it had spread like poison through the castle's foundations, seeping into everyone who had served the crown for generations. Behind him, he heard Captain Morven's laboured breathing grow more ragged. The older man was fighting his own transformation, but Gareth could smell the sickly sweet scent of corruption beginning to emanate from his mentor's body. The chest, Morven gasped between gritted teeth. Gareth, you have to... His words cut off in a strangled cry as his spine arched unnaturally. The ornate chest still lay open in the centre of the chamber, its obsidian surface drinking in the torchlight. The bone fragments and cursed artifacts within pulsed with malevolent energy, but Gareth noticed something else now. A faint script carved into the lid's interior, words in the old tongue that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Prince Aldrich's corrupted form lunged forward with inhuman speed. Gareth barely managed to raise his blade in time, the ancestral steel meeting claws that had erupted from what were once noble fingers. The impact sent shockwaves through both combatants, and where the blessed metal touched the shadow flesh, steam rose with the stench of burning sulphur. You delay the inevitable, Aldrich snarled, pressing forward with supernatural strength. Father has already begun the final ritual. Soon, every soul in this kingdom will join our eternal feast. Through the castle's stone walls, Gareth could hear the sounds of chaos spreading, screams, the clash of steel, and underneath it all, a low chanting that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations. King Theron was completing what his ancestors had started centuries ago, using the curse to transform his subjects into something monstrous. Gareth twisted away from Aldric's grasp and rolled toward the chest. The inscriptions on the lid became clearer as he approached. And with growing horror, he realized they weren't just historical records. They were instructions. The original creators of the curse had also crafted its undoing, but the price was written in stark, unforgiving terms. The willing sacrifice of royal blood, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. By blade blessed in the waters of... Aldric's claws raked across his back, tearing through leather and flesh. Gareth stumbled forward, his blood spattering across the ancient text. Where the droplets touched the carved words, they began to glow with pale fire. "My blood," Gareth breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "I carry the bloodline too." The truth hit him with devastating clarity. His family hadn't just served the crown, they were distant cousins, a cadet branch thought lost to history. The curse recognized him because he shared the same tainted heritage that had doomed the royal line. Captain Morven's transformation accelerated behind him, bones cracking and reforming. Soon, Gareth would face two of these creatures, and his strength was already flagging. The ritual demanded willing sacrifice, but it had to be performed correctly, with the proper words and the consecrated blade. He pressed his palm against the glowing text, feeling the curse's power flow through him like liquid fire. The knowledge flooded his mind, every word of the ancient incantation, every precise movement required to break the bonds that held the shadow realm to this world. But the cost would be everything. Aldric circled him like a predator, no longer rushing to attack. The creature seemed to sense what Gareth was contemplating. "You cannot do it," it taunted. "To break the curse, you must sever the bloodline completely. Every last descendant must perish, including yourself." "Not every descendant," Gareth said quietly, raising his blade. The runes along its edge burned brighter now, fed by his royal blood and desperate purpose. "Only the ones who choose darkness." He began the incantation, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. The ancient words felt like broken glass in his throat, but power flowed through him with each phrase. The curse had made him stronger, but it had also given him the means to destroy it. Aldric shrieked and lunged, but this time Gareth was ready. The blessed blade met corrupted flesh with thunderous force, and the chamber filled with blinding light as the ritual reached its crescendo. The ancient ritual chamber beneath the castle had become a battlefield of flesh and shadow. Sir Marcus pressed his back against the cold stone wall, watching in horror as the creature that had once been Prince Aldric writhed in the center of the summoning circle. Black veins pulsed beneath translucent skin, and where the princess' eyes should have been, twin voids of darkness stared back at him. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The thing wearing Aldric's face spoke, its voice layered with the whispers of 1,000 damned souls. "The bloodline debt must be paid in full." Marcus gripped the blessed silver dagger he'd taken from the chest, the same blade his ancestor had used to wound the demons centuries ago. The metal burned his palm, but he held fast. Around the chamber, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, ancient runes glowing with malevolent energy as they fed on the prince's transformation. Queen Isabel lay crumpled near the altar, her breathing shallow but steady. She had tried to break the ritual by destroying the ceremonial chalice, but the damage was already done. The demon's essence, trapped for so long in the cursed artifacts, had found its new vessel, Marcus. The Queen's weak voice drew his attention. The binding, in the journal, page 73. He risked a glance at the leather tome that had fallen from her hands. Its pages fluttered in an impossible wind that carried the stench of brimstone and decay. Marcus dove for the book as clawed hands, no longer human, swiped at the space where his head had been. The journal's pages were written in his ancestors' careful script, documenting every failed attempt to permanently banish the demon. Page 73 described a ritual of binding that required the blood of both the demon's vessel and the bloodline that had originally summoned it. Marcus's blood. A willing sacrifice, he whispered, understanding flooding through him. His family had guarded this secret not just to protect the kingdom, but because they were the key to ending it. The transformed prince let out a shriek that shattered the ancient mirrors lining the chamber walls. Glass rained down like crystalline tears as the creature's form began to solidify. Wings of shadow unfurled from its back, and its fingers had become talons capable of rending stone. The castle will fall first, it hissed, then the kingdom. Then this world will burn as the last one did. Marcus felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Every guard who had stood watch, every secret kept, every life lost, it had all led to this moment. He thought of Sir Gareth's warnings, of the fear in the old knight's eyes when he'd spoken of things better left buried. Now Marcus understood that fear intimately. The demon turned its attention to Queen Isabel, sensing her weakness. Marcus saw its muscles tense, preparing to strike the final blow that would cement its hold on this realm. Without hesitation, he stepped into the summoning circle. The moment his foot crossed the carved boundary, agony shot through every nerve in his body. The circle had been designed to contain demonic essence, and his family's corrupted bloodline resonated with that dark energy. But he pressed forward, raising the silver dagger. "You want the bloodline debt paid?" Marcus shouted over the howling wind that had erupted from nowhere. "Then let's settle it properly." The creature paused, ancient intelligence flickering behind those void dark eyes. "You would sacrifice yourself? How noble, but futile. The prince's transformation is complete. You cannot unmake what has been." Marcus drove the blessed blade into his own palm, letting his blood flow onto the ritual circle's centermost rune. The effect was immediate and devastating. The chamber filled with blinding white light as centuries of accumulated dark energy began to unravel. The demon's shriek became one of genuine fear as it felt its hold on the prince's body wavering. The binding ritual was working, but Marcus could feel his life force being drawn into it. Each drop of blood that fell seemed to take a year from his life, aging him in moments. "Impossible," the creature snarled, its form already beginning to fade at the edges. "The summoning cannot be reversed. The compact was sealed in blood and shadow." "Every compact can be broken," Marcus gasped, his vision blurring as the ritual consumed him. "With the right price." Prince Aldrich's true voice suddenly broke through the demonic overlay, weak but human. "Marcus, I can see myself again." The silver dagger grew hot in Marcus's hand as the last of the demon's essence was pulled into the binding. The creature fought desperately, claws raking across his chest and leaving deep furrows, but its power was already broken. Queen Isabel struggled to her feet, tears streaming down her face as she watched her most loyal guardian sacrifice everything to save her son. The ritual was nearly complete, but Marcus was fading fast. The ancient evil that had plagued his bloodline for generations finally began to scream its last. The crimson sigil blazed across Sir Marcus's palm like molten iron, its light cutting through the darkness that had consumed the castle's great hall. Around him, the shadows writhed and hissed, retreating from the ancient power coursing through his bloodline, the very curse he had spent his life unknowingly serving. King Aldrich's transformed visage twisted with rage, his elongated features barely recognizable beneath the corruption that had claimed him. "You cannot stop what has already begun, Marcus. The blood moon rises, and with it, our true reign begins." The castle shuddered as more of the cursed artifacts activated throughout its depths. Marcus could feel them calling to the mark on his hand, demanding submission, demanding he join the chorus of darkness that had claimed his ancestors for 7 generations. "The Vorthak bloodline ends with me," Marcus declared, raising his sword toward the possessed king. The blade sang with ethereal light, responding to his rejection of the family curse. Lady Catherine emerged from behind an overturned table, her face pale but determined. "Marcus, the ritual chamber. If we can reach it before the moon reaches its apex, we might still be able to sever the connection." Aldrich's laugh echoed through the hall like breaking glass. "The girl speaks of salvation, but she knows nothing of the price. Tell her, Marcus. Tell her what breaking the curse truly costs." The words died in Marcus's throat. He had seen the truth in the ancient texts hidden within that accursed chest. Breaking the Vorthak curse required the willing sacrifice of the last bearer. His death would sever the bloodline's connection to the dark realm, but it would also leave the kingdom vulnerable to the chaos already unleashed. A new sound pierced the air, the screams of villagers beyond the castle walls. Through the shattered windows, Marcus glimpsed the reason for their terror. The dead were rising from the kingdom's graveyards, animated by the same malevolent force that flowed through his veins. "You see," Aldrich's voice carried a note of triumph. "Every moment you hesitate, more souls are claimed. Your precious kingdom burns while you wrestle with conscience." Marcus felt the sigil pulse against his palm, offering power beyond imagination. He could sense the exact location of every risen corpse, could command them to return to their eternal rest with a mere thought. All he had to do was accept his heritage, embrace the darkness that sang in his blood. Instead, he pressed the blade of his sword against his marked palm. The steel bit deep, and his blood, tainted though it was, flowed freely onto the ancient metal. Where it touched, runes materialized along the fuller, glowing with pure white light. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No!" The word became a battle cry as he charged toward the king. Aldrich moved with inhuman speed, shadows coiling around him like living armor, but Marcus's blood-blessed blade cut through the darkness like a torch through cobwebs. Their weapons clashed with a sound like thunder. Each impact sent shockwaves through the great hall, cracking the ancient stones and shattering the remaining windows. Catherine scrambled toward the spiral staircase that led to the ritual chamber, dodging falling debris as the castle trembled around them. "The bloodline has served faithfully for 7 generations, Aldrich snarled, pressing his attack. His corrupted blade wept shadows with every swing. "Your ancestor made a pact to save this kingdom from invasion. Would you undo his sacrifice?" "His sacrifice became our curse," Marcus parried desperately, feeling his strength wane with each drop of blood that fell from his wounded hand. "Look what it's made of you, of all of us." The king's next strike sent Marcus stumbling backward. As Aldrich raised his weapon for the killing blow, Catherine's voice rang out from the stairwell. "The chamber is open! I can see the binding circle!" Hope flared in Marcus's chest, but it died just as quickly. Aldrich's form began to shift and expand, the last vestiges of humanity falling away like a discarded mask. What emerged was something primordial and terrible, a creature of pure shadow and malice that bore only the faintest resemblance to the man who had once been king. "You cannot reach the chamber." The thing that had been Aldrich spoke with a voice like grinding stone. "The blood moon reaches its apex. Soon every soul in this kingdom will serve the eternal darkness." Through the broken windows, Marcus could see the crimson orb hanging heavy in the sky. In minutes, perhaps seconds, it would reach its zenith, and the curse would become permanent, irreversible. The sigil on his palm burned brighter, responding to his desperation. For one terrible moment, he considered surrender, letting the darkness fill him, using its power to save Catherine and as many innocents as possible before the curse claimed him completely. Then he heard it, the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the courtyard stones below. Reinforcements perhaps, or fleeing survivors. Either way, people who depended on him to stand between them and the nightmare his family had unleashed. Marcus gripped his sword tighter and prepared for what might be his final stand. The ancient blade felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's trembling hands as he stood before the great mirror in the throne room. His reflection stared back, weathered face, loyal eyes, the golden crest of the Royal Guard gleaming on his chest. But behind his image, translucent and writhing, The shadows of his cursed bloodline pressed against the glass like drowning souls seeking air. "You cannot escape what you are," the whispers hissed from every corner of the chamber. "The blood calls to blood. The hunger demands satisfaction." Princess Lyanna lay unconscious on the cold stone floor, her breathing shallow and labored. The curse had already begun its work. Dark veins spider-webbed across her pale skin, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Marcus knew he had perhaps minutes before the transformation became irreversible. The blade, forged centuries ago by his ancestor, the first of the cursed line, was the only weapon capable of severing the supernatural bonds that connected his family to their demonic patron. But the price was absolute. To break the curse would require the life of the last bearer of the bloodline, his own life. Footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond the massive oak doors. The other guards would arrive soon, drawn by the commotion. They would find their princess dying, and their most trusted protector standing over her with an ancient weapon. They would never understand the truth, that he was trying to save her, to save them all. Marcus knelt beside Lyanna, pressing his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was growing fainter, more erratic. The curse was consuming her from within, just as it had consumed so many others over the centuries, just as it had consumed his own father, though Marcus had been too young then to understand why the man had grown so distant, so tormented before his mysterious disappearance. Now he understood. His father had tried to fight it too, had tried to deny the hunger that gnawed at their cursed bloodline. But in the end, the darkness always won, unless it was cut away entirely. "Marcus?" Lyanna's voice was barely a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded. "What's happening to me?" He smoothed her hair back from her fevered brow. "A sickness, Your Highness. But I'm going to make it right." She tried to sit up, but could only manage to lift her head slightly. Her gaze fixed on the blade in his hands, and fear flickered across her features. "The chest, the thing in the darkness. It spoke to me, said we were bound now, said I would serve as you serve." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You will never serve that thing. I swear it on my life." The irony of his words wasn't lost on him. His life was exactly what this would cost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows in the mirror began to take shape, twisted faces of his ancestors, all those who had fed the curse over the generations. Their eyes burned with supernatural hunger. Their mouths opened in silent screams of eternal torment. "You are ours," they hissed in unison, "as we are yours. The contract cannot be broken. The bloodline cannot be severed. You will feed us as we fed it, as our children's children will feed it until the end of days." Marcus raised the blade, its edge catching the torchlight. The metal seemed to pulse with its own inner fire, responding to his resolve. For the first time since discovering that accursed chest, he felt a moment of peace, a sense of rightness. This was why he had found it. Not by accident, not by mere chance while inspecting the foundations. He had been drawn to it, led to this moment where he could choose sacrifice over surrender. "The contract was signed in blood," he said, his voice growing stronger, "and blood will break it." The blade bit deep into his palm as he gripped it. His blood, black as midnight and thick as honey, dripped onto the stone floor. Where it landed, the shadows recoiled as if burned. The faces in the mirror contorted in rage and fear. "No, you will damn us all. We will fade to nothing. You will be free," Marcus finished. "As will she. As will every generation that comes after." Lyanna's hand found his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her condition. "Marcus, don't. There has to be another way." He smiled down at her. His princess, his charge, the light he had sworn to protect. "Sometimes the greatest service requires the greatest sacrifice, Your Highness." The throne room doors burst open. Captain Aldrich and 3 guards rushed in, weapons drawn. They stopped short at the scene before them. Their princess on the floor, Marcus kneeling beside her with a bloodied blade. "Step away from her," Aldrich commanded. "Drop your weapon." Marcus met his old friend's eyes one final time. "Tell them I died with honor, Aldrich. Tell them I kept my oath." The blade turned inward, finding its mark with terrible precision. The ancient stone chamber trembled as Sir Roderick pressed the cursed blade against his own throat, the metal burning cold against his skin. The whispers of his ancestors filled the air around him, their voices a cacophony of hunger and rage that had echoed through generations of his bloodline. "You cannot escape what you are," the spectral form of his great-grandfather hissed, his translucent figure materializing from the shadows. "The curse flows through your veins, boy. You are one of us now." Roderick's hand shook as he held the blade steady. Behind him, Princess Elara lay unconscious on the altar, her life force slowly draining into the ancient runes carved deep into the stone. The ritual was nearly complete. One more death, one more soul offered to the darkness, and his family's pact would be sealed for another century. "I won't let you have her," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the supernatural chorus. "I won't let you have anyone else." The ghostly figures of his ancestors circled him like vultures, their faces twisted with centuries of corruption. His father stepped forward, the man Roderick had once admired and loved, now revealed as a willing servant of the curse. "You think your death will end this?" His father's spirit laughed, the sound like grinding bone. "The princess will die regardless. The ritual demands royal blood, and she is the last of her line. Your sacrifice changes nothing." But Roderick had spent the last hour studying the inscriptions on the chamber walls, deciphering the ancient text that revealed the true nature of the curse. It wasn't just about royal blood, it was about willing sacrifice, about the continuation of his family's dark covenant. If he died by his own hand, if he broke the chain of willing participants, the curse would turn inward, consuming itself. "You're wrong," he said, pressing the blade deeper until a thin line of blood appeared on his throat. "The curse needs a willing heir to continue. Without me, it dies." The temperature in the chamber plummeted as the assembled spirits realized what he intended. They lunged forward as one, their ethereal forms becoming solid in their desperation. But Roderick was ready. He had one advantage they didn't expect, the very curse they had inflicted upon him. Drawing upon the dark power that flowed through his veins, he created a barrier of pure will around himself and the altar. The spirits crashed against it like waves against stone, their shrieks of rage echoing off the chamber walls. "You cannot deny your blood," his great-grandfather roared, his form growing more solid, more terrible. "The darkness is part of you now." "Yes," Roderick agreed, tears streaming down his face. "But I choose how to use it." He began to draw the cursed blade across his throat, but stopped as Elara stirred behind him. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to horror as she saw the spectral army surrounding them. "Roderick," she whispered, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "Don't look at them," he commanded, his voice gentle despite the chaos around them. "Close your eyes, princess. This will be over soon." But Elara's gaze fell upon the ancient text carved into the altar beneath her, and her eyes widened with understanding. As a scholar of the old languages, she could read what Roderick had missed in his haste, a single line that changed everything. "Wait," she gasped, grabbing his wrist. "The binding can be transferred. The curse can be broken without death." The spirits paused their assault, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Roderick looked down at the princess, hope warring with desperation in his heart. "Royal blood willingly given," Elara read aloud, her voice growing stronger. "Not taken, but given freely. The curse seeks a willing host of noble blood, but it can be satisfied with a different kind of sacrifice." Understanding dawned on Roderick's face. The curse didn't require death. It required submission, a willing surrender of one's bloodline to the darkness. But if royal blood was offered freely, not in death but in binding, the curse could be contained, redirected. Without hesitation, Elara took the blade from his trembling hands and drew it across her palm. Her blood dripped onto the ancient runes, which began to glow with silver light instead of the sickly green they had shown before. The spirits of Roderick's ancestors screamed as the binding shifted, the curse flowing away from his family and into the royal bloodline, but not as corruption, as guardianship, as a sacred duty to keep the darkness contained. The ghostly figures began to fade, their power broken, their hunger finally satiated by willing sacrifice rather than murder. Roderick's father looked at him one last time, and for a moment his face showed not evil but profound sadness. "Forgive me," the spirit whispered, before dissolving into silver mist. As the last of the supernatural presence faded from the chamber, Roderick caught Ilara as she collapsed, her sacrifice having drained much of her strength. The curse was broken, but at a cost. She would carry the burden of containing the ancient darkness for the rest of her life. "Why?" he asked, cradling her against his chest. "Because," she whispered, "some burdens are meant to be shared."